When I was a little girl, my very favorite fairy tale of all time was Cinderella. I thought she must have been the most beautiful girl in the whole world. And I even loved the way that she was patient and with her stepsisters, and the way that she went about her daily chores without complaining. I probably was only about 6 years old, but that made an impression on me. And I also noticed how the most handsome man at the ball pursued her and loved her and searched for her until he found the foot that fit into the glass slipper. And then they married and lived happily ever after. Well, I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to marry my prince in this big, beautiful wedding, and then we will live happily ever after. Well, I'm evidently not the only girl who thought that, because I'm told that the statistics for 2019 said that the average cost of a wedding was $28,000. I think the pandemic brought down that figure just a little bit, but $28,000, and that was the average cost of a wedding in 2019. That means that a lot of the weddings cost more than that. And then I also found an article when I was researching this lesson that explained that the traditional fairy tales may be partly to blame for this. The article said that the fairy tales express widespread hopes, and they place an emphasis on weddings. And the result is that many women visualize themselves as the heroine in that fairy tale, and then they want this big, huge extravaganza event just like they imagined in the fairy tale. But what happens after the wedding? Research shows that almost 50% of all marriages will end in divorce. And these fairy tales may be timeless, but they don't tell men and women that are going into marriage how to be and how to have a successful and happy marriage. But thankfully, we do have instructions for that. And we do have instructions that will tell us how to live happily ever after. But it's not in fairy tales. We know that. We know that it's in the same book that answers every question we possibly could have, every dilemma that we face in life. And that book, of course, is the Bible. Our topic for the next few minutes is Paul's timeless message for wives. And the primary text will be in Ephesians 5:22 through 32. So let's read that to get the entire section, Ephesians 5:22 through 32. It says, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever hated his own flesh, but nourisheth it and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." And in this chapter, in the 5th chapter of Ephesians, Paul tells his reader that we are to walk in several ways. If we'll look up to verse 2, it tells us to walk in love. And it says, "And walk in love as Christ also hath loved us and hath given himself for us." And then if we move down to verse 8, it says, "Are ye light in the Lord? Walk as children of light." So we're to walk in love, we're to walk in light, and then verse 15 tells us how to walk in wisdom. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. And then the rest of this chapter tells us how to be wise, and included in these verses are the instructions on how our behavior should be within our marriage. And this passage tells us that if we follow these commands, then we are wise. And I think all of us want to be thought of as wise. Proverbs 1:5 says, a wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsel. And the book of Proverbs is referenced by many people as the book of wise sayings, and God chose to give us an entire book of wise sayings, practical wisdom that will benefit each of us if we will only pay attention to those proverbs, those wise sayings. And so Ephesians 5:15 through the rest of the chapter tells us that if we comply with this passage that we're studying today, then we will be wise. And I know I want to be wise, and I think each of you do as well. Ephesians 5 is very clear, and Paul gives us an analogy of the husband and our home as they are compared to Christ and the church. And I told someone earlier this week that I had the easiest lesson to teach this week because the Bible is so clear on this subject. But just because it's clear doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to put into practice, especially in today's society. And from early childhood, we're told that, we can do anything that a man can do. And that is true to a certain extent. And in the business world, we see women in managerial roles, and it's not a sin for a man to report to a woman in secular work. And it's not a sin for a Christian woman to have men report to her in a secular job. God doesn't address this particular situation in the workplace other than to give us instructions on how a Christian should act both as an employee and an employer. And we find these scriptures in Ephesians 6:5-9, and in 1 Timothy 6:1. Ecclesiastes 9:10 says, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. But these commands are for everyone, male and female, and the scriptures don't give us guidance for men and women in the workplace based on gender. But he does address our homes. And we know that the home is one of the 3 ordained institutions that we read about in the Bible. The other 2 are the government and, of course, the church. And the home is the first institution that God established, and he tells us what he expects from our homes. And specifically in this passage in Ephesians, the capabilities of the wife, that's not the issue. The issue is our role in the home as God commands it. And we're not talking about the business world, but we're talking about the home, and we're talking about your home and my home. Verse 21 of our scripture says, submitting yourselves to one another in the fear of God. And verse 22 says, wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord. So let's talk about submission for a few minutes. In our ladies' class at Forest Hill last quarter, we studied a book by Deborah Mitchell called Blessed Beyond Measure. And each chapter dealt in depth with a blessing. And one of the blessings that we studied was submission. Well, most of us don't think of submission as a blessing. And if we're honest with ourselves, we may look at submission as more of a burden than a blessing. But Sister Mitchell's book asks the question, why do we submit? And each one of us needs to examine our hearts and ask ourselves that question. And when we think about it, there's really several reasons why we submit. Most importantly, we want to obey God. But we also submit because we love our husbands, and we love the one to whom we are submitting. And of all possible emotions, love is the greatest. We know that we read in 1 Corinthians 13:13, and now abideth faith, hope, and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Love is greatest because it is eternal. And I'd never thought about this until I was studying for this particular lesson, but it is true that in a sense, trust and confidence will exist in heaven. The faith and the hope that we have here on earth won't be needed any longer. In other words, once we are in heaven, then faith is no longer the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It's a reality. And hope is no longer the expectation of heaven because we will be there. Heaven will be real at that point, but love is eternal. Love is the greatest because it flows over everything. I think about those cakes that when you pour the icing over it, sometimes you punch holes in the top of the cake and then you pour the icing over it. And it just oozes, the icing just oozes into the cake, and then it moves to the edges, and then it spreads over the edges of the cake. And it covers the whole cake and makes it so good. And that's what love does. We can have faith. We can have hope of our salvation. Hope that is an anchor for us and assures us of our salvation. But love enriches both faith and hope. And love enriches our marriages as well. Love is a decision, and it's a promise that we made when we got married. And we make a choice every day. And staying in love takes a commitment. Another reason we submit to our husbands is because every institution, and that includes every home, needs leadership, and it needs defined roles. If we did not have defined roles, we would have chaos. And our homes need this for practical reasons. We need order so that we can accomplish the hundreds of tasks that are required and that are done every day to make our homes peaceful. On the practical side, someone has to cook, do the laundry, wash the dishes, scrub the toilets, mop the floors, grocery shop, make repairs, even if it's just replacing a light bulb, someone has to do that. Cut the lawn, take care of children, take care of pets, make the bed, change the sheets, vacuum, deal with the mail, pay bills, clean the kitchen multiple times every day, take out the trash, dust, clean the shower or the tub or both, clean the fridge, deal with leftovers, clean the oven, change the oil, make the bed. I think I said that one twice. But if we want an orderly home and a peaceful home, if we want a home that our husband and our children want to come home to at the end of the day, then these things have to be done. And finally, when talking about reasons that we submit to our husband, we submit because we have respect for God and respect for our husband. And we've probably heard that respect is one of, the one attribute that is most important to a man. I got some information from, it's a family therapist. Look down to, before I get to that, look down to verse 33 in Ephesians 5. It says, "Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband." So just as we need the love from our husband, a man needs respect. And I did want to make a note that, on a side note, if you are feeling frustrated with your marriage, first pray about your marriage Ask the Lord to respect your husband, and then start respecting him with your words and your actions. And a transformation may not happen overnight, but you may be amazed at the results. And keep doing these things that show respect, and keep praying, and you never know what will happen. Because respect provides that encouragement that a man needs. And it makes a man want to love his wife even more. And respect builds him up, and it makes him feel confident. And this is where I found the information from the family therapist who said that she asked some men in her practice to help her understand why respect is so important to a husband. And here are some of the answers that she got. They said, respect gives a husband the belief that he can do hard things. Another husband said that receiving respect from his most intimate friend, his wife, reduces his fear of failure and of being inadequate. Another explained respect this way. He said, it is like winds in my sails. No one knows me like my wife does. Her level of respect for me is a very accurate barometer on how I am doing, and my confidence to do hard things is very connected to that. And so finally, when we're talking about respect for a husband, respect acknowledges his leadership. And giving respect shows that the husband is the leader in that home and in that relationship. But if we have a leader, we also have a follower. And submission usually doesn't come naturally to most people. And why is that? Sometimes we just think we're right. Sometimes our reasons are a little more complex. Sometimes we want to do what we want to do, but when you think about it, that's really just the definition of selfishness. And sometimes we give in to society's view of marriage, and we perceive that we're giving up our independence when we submit. Sometimes we let anger take over. And at that point, we simply don't care about anyone else, about God or our husband, our children, our family. And we know that's a worldly view. And if we have that, then we know we need to face it and correct it if we find ourselves leaning in that direction. But just as we studied in our ladies' class this book, Blessed Beyond Measure, we also learned that we receive blessings from God's, when we follow God's command and when we submit. And the most important blessing is that we know that we have God's approval. And following God's commands in Ephesians 5 will bring the husband and wife closer together. And there will naturally be less chaos in the house and more personal happiness. One woman that I read about said that on her golden wedding anniversary, so that's 50 years of marriage, she revealed the secret of her long and happy marriage. And she said that on her wedding day, she decided to choose 10 of her husband's faults, which for the sake of their marriage, she decided then that she would overlook them. And so on this golden wedding anniversary celebration, someone asked her to name some of those faults of her husband. And she said, well, to tell you the truth, I never did get around to listing them. But whenever my husband did something that made me mad, I would say to myself, lucky for him, that was one of those 10. So when we talk about love being a decision, this is an example of that. It's a choice that we have to see the good in our husband every day rather than focusing on the negative things that bother us. And when we love them as they are, then that's showing that love is a decision. If we go into marriage thinking that we're going to change this person that we plan to marry, then we're setting our marriages and ourselves up to fail. We all have flaws and quirks and faults, and accepting those differences is part of love. Overlooking flaws and forgiving faults is a big part. They are a big part of a successful marriage. When we talk about blessings that come from submitting to others, and in this case, submitting to our husband, most people feel better when they have helped someone. And when they've submitted their will for the common good, and particularly our families, when we see that we have helped them, then that brings us happiness and contentment. And studies have shown that helping others boosts our happiness and our health and our sense of well-being. Submitting to our husbands can also help us keep things in perspective. We're such a me society, but submitting helps us have a more realistic perspective. It helps us see the situation from someone else's point of view. Life is not all about me. And one person said that marriage is when you agree to spend the rest of your life sleeping in a room that's too warm beside someone who's sleeping in a room that's too cold. And that's a pretty good description. Bottom line, it's not about me. And when we marry, when we choose to take a husband, we're now thinking about two people. And also, submitting can be contagious. Have you ever let someone have their way and then shortly after that, they reciprocate? This works with husbands also. Not all the time, but it does work with husbands also. God has established the chain of authority in the home just as Christ is the head of the church, and the husband is the head of the home. If we turn to Genesis 3:16, it says, Genesis 3:16 says, "Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." In the New Testament, we have 1 Timothy 2:11 through 14. And we hear a lot today about first century culture, and we hear that the man as the leader in both the church and the home is only a cultural tradition. But the Bible tells us this is not so. In 1 Timothy 2:11 through 14, this is taken from the ASV. It says, "Let a woman learn in quietness with all subjection, but I permit not a woman to teach nor to have dominion over a man, but to be in quietness. For Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Adam was not beguiled, but the woman being beguiled had fallen into transgression." Adam was created first, and Eve was created to be a helpmate for Adam. And the order in which God created man and woman expresses and determines the relationship that God intended and the order of authority. God's plan was that Adam was formed first, and he was to be the leader. And in this verse in 1 Timothy, Paul is telling Timothy that God set it up that way from the beginning. Adam was not deceived, but the woman became the transgressor. In Dave Miller's exegesis of 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15, he says that verse 12 explains why men and women have their respective roles. It is because Adam was first formed, as we just said. But then Brother Miller says that verse 14 is an example of what happens when the role of leadership and submission is violated. Eve's sin is not the reason for female subordination, but it's an example of the consequences of acting out of harmony with the principle that God has given us. When Eve took the lead in partaking of the fruit and getting her husband to do the same thing, she violated God's designated arrangement of male-female relations. And when the roles established by God in creation were reversed by Eve, it had a disastrous effect. And that's what Brother Miller says. He goes on to say, God's displeasure with Adam includes not only the eating of the forbidden fruit, but his abdication of spiritual leadership. Notice God's words, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife." That's Genesis 3:17. By that he meant not that men should not listen to their wives, but that Adam allowed his wife to take the lead instead of being the head of his family as he was created to be. And when Eve ignored the principle of submission by taking the leadership role over her husband, the results were catastrophic. And Brother Miller concludes his comments by saying she should have deferred to the authority of God and to the leadership of her husband. The Bible tells us that man is the head because he was first created, and we were created to be a helpmeet. God created man first, and God established the authority of the man over the wife. And most of our lesson has dealt with Ephesians 5:22 through 24 that specifically addresses the wife's submission to their husbands. But in a Christian home, the husband and wife have an agape love for one another. They have mutual respect and concern, and both have the desire to become more like Christ every day. And when these attributes are present, there's honest communication, and many of the decisions in the home are joint decisions. But ultimately, when there's a difference of opinion on a decision, then it's the husband's responsibility to make that final decision, and it's our responsibility to support that decision. And it's also important that we teach this to our children and make sure that they understand this. One of the books that I studied in preparation for this lesson is actually by Jenny Knox, who's here today. So I'm so glad she's here today. I love that book. It's Between Here and Heaven. And she lists 5 things that says, don't get married if. So I don't know if this is going to... Good. I was afraid it wasn't formatted correctly. But the first one is, don't get married if you're not ready to leave your parents. Basically, when problems come up in a marriage, and they will, don't run to mom or dad for sympathy. They don't even need to know when you have a disagreement with your husband. Work it out with him. The second one, don't get married if you are not trustworthy. And she bases this on Proverbs 31:11. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her. And research from the website that I referenced earlier about the current divorce rate also noted that one of the primary reasons for divorce today is adultery. And historically, it's been the man who committed adultery. However, I've seen, and you probably have too, in the last 20 years or so, women being the adulterers. But regardless if it's the husband or the wife that cheats, it breaks the trust between them. And when the trust is broken in a marriage, it's very difficult to get back. It can be done, but it's hard. And we should make sure that we place an emphasis on strengthening the trust with our husband. And whether that's a sexual trust or a financial trust, buying things and hiding them where he doesn't see it, doesn't know what we've spent, or maybe it's simply keeping things private within the marriage, those things that are confidential, that should be kept confidential. Our husband should never be concerned that we'll share something with others that he's told us in confidence. Don't get married if you're not willing to do your share of the work to keep up the household. This is about as practical as it gets. And marriage is hard, and part of what's hard about it is the day-to-day chores that are required in a home. And we talked earlier about the cleaning and cooking and the repairs and the yard work and all the daily tasks that go into making a household run smoothly. And the practical side of marriage is hard work. It's not for the lazy. And we need to know this before marriage and teach it to our children. Be prepared for the realities of marriage. Clothes on the floor do not magically disappear. And I'm going to say something now that I may get some pushback on, but we need to hear it because the Bible teaches it. So here it is. The idea of needing or having to have me time is a worldly view. And lots of Christian women have bought into that idea. The world tells women that they need and deserve time to find themselves. Women are being told they must find the time to re-energize by focusing on themselves for a while. The main idea is for women to relax and treat ourselves to activities that make us happy and that will refuel us for our everyday lives. And that doesn't sound all bad. And these ideas aren't bad in and of themselves. But there are some things that the secular world does not consider about that. First of all, God is the creator, and he's the owner of everything that exists, and even our precious blessing of our time. It belongs to God. It does not belong to me. The world would have us believe otherwise. Me time says it's mine. I have rights to it. I deserve to spend it however I choose. But as Christians, we're his. We belong to him. And just as our lives are not our own, neither is our time. How we spend our time must ultimately be how he wants us to spend it. Me time says that if I live for myself, I will benefit. But for a Christian, the way up is down. When the disciples disputed over who is the greatest, Jesus said the greatest will be the least in Luke 22:6. He also said the first in the world will be the last, Matthew 19:30. The humble will be exalted, Matthew 23:12. Giving is better than receiving, Acts 20:35. And dying brings life, Luke 9:24. This means don't put physical things above the spiritual. But the world calls these concepts foolishness. And sadly, Christians have begun to think like the world in many instances. Sometimes we get caught up in serving our families more out of obligation than for love, and then we begin to view mundane tasks as insignificant. And if we really believe the importance of caring for our husbands and our children, maybe we wouldn't need alone time as much as we think we do. And if you are writing down scriptures, you may want to jot down Matthew 10:42 and Colossians 3:23 through 24 as references to read later. Loving our families would become more of a joy instead of a burden. Our hope and sense of fulfillment would be set more on the Lord and his promises. Remember Romans 12:2, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Don't think like the world. And mothers of young children, there will come a day when the children don't require you 24/7. They'll still need our wisdom and our guidance, but they won't need as much time just because of the natural maturing that they are doing and the independence that they're gaining as they get older and to become independent adults. But when they're young, don't sacrifice the time that they need when they're young. That's all I'm going to say about that. But to wrap up this thought, don't get married if you're not ready for 100% commitment to the work that a marriage brings. And especially if you bring children into the marriage, then you must be willing to do the work and devote the time that is needed and commanded by God. The fourth thing on Sister Knox's list says, don't get married if you're not ready for a lifelong commitment. She says, marriage is for life, and that is a long, long time. Marriage is for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. And yes, over the course of a lifelong marriage, there's a lot of better, and there's also some worse. Those of us married for very long at all realize that marriage has its peaks and valleys, and without a commitment made long before those marriage vows, the marriage may not hold up. Make that commitment before you get married. Talk with the one that you want to marry and make sure he has that same commitment. And then number 5, from Sister Knox, particularly goes along with our lesson today, Don't get married if you're not willing to submit to your husband. Selflessness is part of marriage, so be prepared. And when choosing a mate, there's a lot to consider. I also want to share some material from Gary Colley's book, The Ideal Home. I just thought this was another very good practical list of principles that have stood the test of time for a good marriage. So please consider these questions when dating or choosing your husband. Does this person have spiritual values and put them first? Can you honestly say that this person seeks first the kingdom of God, as we read about in Matthew 6:33? Will this person be an active member of the Lord's church, and will he help me go to heaven? Your mate will either help you or hinder you on your life journey to heaven. Does this person have proper qualities to be a good parent? Parenting opens up a whole new dimension of ways to disagree. But will your husband be a strong leader and father in the home who will actively love and train the children? Do I love this person enough to be one with him in God's sight? And this involves the emotional, it involves sexual, and intellectual support that we need to provide. We may think of these things as the support that we need, but men need them too. And they need to know that we will be there to give them that support. When things aren't going well at work, or maybe even when his friends turn against him, or when he loses confidence in himself. Does my intended mate have a biblical view of marriage and divorce? Is he in agreement that divorce is only possible if adultery occurs, as we read about in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9? If he does not believe that adultery is the only reason for divorce, then his commitment to the marriage will most likely not be very strong. Is the love that we feel for one another agape love and not solely eros? Is our love an unselfish, active love and not just physical gratification? Physical love is very important to a marriage, but it's not enough to hold a marriage together when the temptations from the world come along. And when thinking about things to consider when choosing a husband, we need to ask ourselves, can I honestly give thanks to God for the spiritual direction of this person's life? Is God and the Bible and all things spiritual important to my prospective husband? And then the last one, am I willing to submit to this man? Am I willing to follow his lead even when I disagree with him? Some of you have heard me say that it's easy to follow someone when you agree with them. And the true test of submission comes when they make a decision that's different from the decision that you think is best. You may have heard the story of the rancher who had 2 sons, and the rancher became ill, and he knew that he was not going to be able to do all the things on the ranch that needed to be done. So he called in his sons to his bedside, and he explained that he still had big plans, but he was going to rely on them to carry out his wishes. So he explained to them what all he needed to be done, and he even wrote down precise instructions for them, and they both agreed that yes, they would follow his instructions. So the first instruction that needed to be done was that a fence needed to be built for the new horses that were to be purchased. And so the sons looked at the plans for the fence, and they agreed that yes, the place that their father had specified was the perfect place for the new fence. It was relatively close to the barn, and it was also close to pasture land for the horses to eat. And so they followed his instructions to the letter, and they built the fence exactly where he had said build it. And then the next instruction was to tear down an old barn that had been used in years past to store hay. And so the sons went to the old barn, and they agreed that yes, the old barn needed to come down. It was beyond repair. So they did it, and they even followed their dad's instructions on sorting out the rotten wood while saving the good wood for future projects. And then they looked at the last instruction that the father had given them. And his last instruction was to build a new barn for the hay. And so his instructions were very clear: build it halfway between the fence gate and the old barn that they had torn down. So the sons read the instruction, but one of them said that he thought it would be better if they built it closer to the house, about 100 yards from where the father had instructed. And the other son agreed with his brother, and so he said he thought it was a good idea because it would be closer to the house. So the end of the story is that the two sons built the new barn closer to the house, just as they wanted. And my question is, when did the sons follow their father's instructions? And we may be tempted to say that they followed him when they built the fence and when they tore down the old barn, but they chose not to follow him, not to submit to his instructions when they built the new barn, the last instruction. But the truth is, they did not submit to his instructions at all. This is because as long as they were in agreement with his wishes, they were supposedly following his instructions, but reality is they were always, from the very beginning, doing what they wanted to do. And it's just the case that the father's instructions for the first two tasks happened to agree with what they wanted to do also. But when a disagreement came up, they chose to do what they wanted to do. And is this the way that we as wives sometimes respond to our husbands? As long as we're in agreement, everything is good, and we smugly tell ourselves that I'm submitting to my husband. But then when we have a difference of opinion, who do we follow? Our own wishes? Or do we truly submit to our husband's decision? Has your husband ever said, well, you're going to do what you want to do anyway? If he says this, or if he thinks this, then we're not submitting and we're not following God's instructions on Ephesians 5. And so we've talked about questions to ask when we're choosing a husband, and we've talked about the marriage ceremony and getting to know each other during that first year of discoveries and learning to live with one another. And I also made some comments, but we're out of time, so I'm not going to be able to go into it, but it is in the book, so read the book. But I will just say, encourage him, give him your time and attention, praise him in private and in public, say thank you. Sometimes those two little words are magical. Admit when you're wrong and forgive him when he's wrong. Marriage is not the place for power struggles. Life is too short to stay mad or even upset with one another for days. And don't make every disagreement a battle. Sometimes it just doesn't matter. We are on the same team with our husbands. And chances are, if it doesn't have permanent consequences, then it doesn't matter. Just say, I'm sorry, and move on. And many of us have had wedding vows that said love, honor, and obey. And this is the last thing I want to say today. Love him and honor him and respect him. Submit to him when the rubber meets the road. When you disagree, you may not agree with every decision, but follow his lead and submit to him. And then regardless of the result, don't ever say, I told you so. If it doesn't work out the way he thought it would, if it doesn't work out for the best, he knows that. He doesn't need you to tell him. And this is the time when he needs your love and support and respect. So as we close, God has given his law on the home and on the authority in the home. And if we're wise and if we're pleasing to God, then we will follow Paul's timeless message for wives that we find in Ephesians 5. So thank you all for being here this week and today. Thank you for being patient, listening to me. Sometimes I feel that I just run a race to get through everything. So I really do appreciate your attention. Thank you.